Have you ever finished your first pass of the hairstroke technique on a client? You wipe the skin clean, only to find that the strokes you have painstakingly tattooed are barely visible in the skin. It's so disheartening and frustrating when that happens because it makes the rest of your treatment so much harder than it needs to be because you've lost your guidelines. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to get crisp, visible hair strokes on the first pass. It really comes down to three things that most artists are overlooking. And it starts with this. Firstly, the pre-sketch. Now, if you haven't seen my full pre-sketch lesson, I'll link to that at the end of this video so you can learn how to map and draw the entire pattern onto the skin. But for now, you just need to understand this. If your sketch isn't fine and accurate, your first pass won't be either. What I see with a lot of artists learning the hairstroke technique is that they're starting to tattoo their first pass with a sketch that's actually quite thick, quite messy, and sometimes even slightly smudged. And it might not feel like a big deal in the moment because I get it, after a long mapping session, you just want to get started on tattooing. But having a messy pre-sketch is risky because when you start tattooing your first pass, you're not actually following a precise line. You're guessing. You're choosing where inside that thick smudgy line the stroke should sit. And that's where things start to go wrong. So imagine you've mapped out a brow, okay? And you've sketched on your first strokes. But instead of really fine hair-like guidelines, you've got quite thick crayon lines sitting on the skin. Now, when you place the tip of your needle down on the skin, you don't have a single clear path to follow. You've got like a zone of working within. And even if your hand technique is good, even if your machine setup is correct, your strokes will look slightly off. You know, they might sit too close together or slightly outside of where they should be or a bit wobbly. And that's when you finish your first pass and you think, why don't these look as crisp as I hoped? So what you need to try and achieve is to get your pre-sketch looking like the finished tattooed result. Really fine, really sharp, because at that point, your job during the first pass becomes very simple. You're not figuring out where to place the strokes, you're just tracing over your precise line that you've already drawn. And that gives you a better chance of performing a good, visible first pass. All right, now that's clear, let's move on to point number 2. Once your pre-sketch is perfected, you need to consider what machine and needle you're using to get the best result. Because even with a perfect sketch, the wrong needle or machine could limit your ability to create that crisp first pass. The problem is that many artists simply aren't educated on how to choose the right machine or needle for the skin that they're working on. So they use the same setup for every client, regardless of whether the skin is thick, thin, mature, or sensitive. And when the result isn't what they expected, they assume something is wrong with their technique, when actually it could be the machine or the needle. So what this often looks like in practice is, so say an artist goes in with a one-round liner. They do their first few strokes, wipe the skin clean, and oh dear, the stroke isn't very visible. They haven't been able to get that pigment into the skin, so they panic. Then they switch to a 3-round liner, or even a magnum, because they're thinking, I just need to get more pigment going into the skin as quickly as possible. And yes, with a 3-round liner and a magnum, it will go in easier than a 1-round liner. But now the strokes are thicker, they're less precise and fine. So they've solved the saturation problem, but they've lost that fine line crispness completely. So the goal is to choose the right needle and machine for the skin so the pigment goes in easily without overworking the skin and causing too much trauma. That means understanding 2 things primarily. So first, your machine. For this client in this video, I'm using the Artist H2 Power Babe, which is a 3.5mm long stroke. I tend to prefer long stroke machines because it allows me to implant the pigment efficiently and work a bit faster because it's got more power behind it. But if I'm working on very mature paper thin skin or sensitive skin, I'll switch to a shorter stroke machine to be more gentle. So secondly, you need to pay attention to your needle. If you want a fine, crisp hair stroke, you need to use a 1-round liner. There isn't really a workaround here. A 3-round liner will deposit more pigment, but it physically cannot give you that same fine line a 1-round liner can. In this video, in this case, I'm using a 0.30 one round liner long taper for the tail and the finer detail strokes, and a slightly thicker 0.35 one round liner long taper capillary needle for the rest of the brows. Both the Cheyenne cartridges. They're great. I like using Cheyenne. But if this client had thick, oily skin, I would use a thicker needle. So it changes. You have to choose the right setup from the start for that particular client, that skin type. There is no one size that fits all. Okay, let's move on to the final point 3, which will enable you to get crisp first pass. This is the part that really determines whether your strokes look soft and blurry or crisp and fine. Your speed and your hand technique. The problem is that many artists don't fully understand how to move the machine through the skin to create a crisp hair stroke. There are multiple techniques you can use to implant pigment, but not all of them are designed for hair strokes. So what happens is artists are often using the wrong movement for the result they're trying to achieve. A really common one is the pendulum movement. This is where the hand moves in a kind of etching or swinging motion. And it creates more of a pixelated effect in the skin. That works well for shading, for powder brows. But if you try and use that same movement for hair strokes, you'll never get a crisp fine line. The stroke will look soft or slightly blurred. So if you want a crisp hair stroke, you have to do the opposite of that. Instead of brushing the top of the skin with the needle, you want to stay in the skin. If you watch my hand in this video, you'll see that I enter the skin with the needle and then I move slowly along the stroke without lifting the needle out. It's one continuous motion, and that does two things. First, it reduces trauma because you're not repeatedly hitting the skin with like that pendulum etching motion. And second, it allows the pigment to sit evenly through the entire stroke, which is what gives you that saturated, crisp result from the off. Now, the key here is slow machine and slow hand. I'm usually working around 5 to 6 volts and matching that with a controlled, steady movement. There's no rushing this part because the moment you speed up, you lose the line as the pigment doesn't have time to enter the skin. So when you bring all three of these things together, you've got a precise pre-sketch, the right machine and needle, and controlled, consistent hand movement. That's when you start getting a decent, crisp first pass. So as I mentioned earlier, if you want to see exactly how I map and pre-sketch onto the skin, I've broken that down step by step in another lesson, and you can watch that by clicking this video here. And if you're at the stage where you're struggling with things like how to create different patterns to make it look realistic, or understanding how to work on different skin types, then I'd recommend joining my free Hyperrealism Brows Mastery community. Inside there, I share more in-depth training, provide guidance to help you refine your technique and how to get more clients, which is ultimately what we all want, to have successful permanent makeup businesses. So I'll leave a link for that in the description below as well. And if this video helped you, you can always subscribe and the YouTube gods will drop you a notification when I post the next one. But for now, go and click this next video to learn how to do the pre-sketch.